The door of the Red Hollow schoolhouse was found bolted from the inside. When Sheriff Amos Reed pried it open on the morning of October 3, 1931, the first thing he saw was the row of children, 13 of them sitting perfectly still at their desks, eyes open, faces pale as chalk. At the front of the room, a woman in a faded gray dress sat upright in her chair, hands folded neatly over a lesson plan. Her name was Margaret Ellis, the only teacher within 30 miles of Pine County, Georgia. The coroner's report said the children had been dead for over 12 hours, but the ink on the blackboard, the words Lesson 9, the value of obedience, was still wet. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. This isn't a ghost story. It's a record, a forgotten corner of American history, where faith, fever, and silence merged, and one woman's lesson outlasted the living. The photograph is grainy, edges frayed by time. A woman stands before the Pine County Courthouse, 1924. Her name, Margaret Ellis. The frame captures her mid-breath, chin lifted, parasol angled like a blade against the sun. The paper that ran. The image called her a woman of fine education and unbending faith. What the paper didn't say was how she had come to Pine County alone, or why she never left. She was born in 1893, near Macon, Georgia, the daughter of a railroad clerk and a midwife. Raised in a house where silence meant discipline and prayer filled every other space. In 1914, she graduated from the Georgia Normal and Industrial College, an institution built to forge teachers who could rebuild the South through instruction, morality, and order. She believed learning was not merely knowledge, but obedience. To know was to submit. To understand was to endure. When the county board posted her to Red Hollow, a township of 212 souls, she accepted without hesitation. The journey took her by train, then mule cart. When she arrived, she found a single schoolhouse leaning against a slope of red earth. The windows were shattered. The stove rusted through. Her students came barefoot, smelling of cotton dust and turpentine. They worked the fields at dawn and arrived by noon with hands already blistered. Margaret wrote in one of her first letters, now preserved in the Pine County Historical Archive, that the children suffered from a famine, not of bread, but of spirit. Their words carry no reverence, their eyes no fear of the Lord. That first winter, she taught by lamplight. She mended the glass with wax paper and scripture pages torn from old hymnals. Each lesson began and ended with a prayer, and she kept a ledger so precise it read like confession. Attendance digits, arithmetic division, behavior satisfactory, morality lacking. By 1930, she had grown disillusioned with the official curriculum. The arithmetic primers felt hollow, to her too mechanical, too godless. So she began composing her own. She called it the Book of Moral Arithmetic. The pages, written in careful ink, matched mathematical order to divine justice. When a child sins, she wrote, the sum must be corrected. No mistake remains unpaid. Each chapter tied virtue to calculation. 2 wrongs did not make a right. They multiplied consequence. A divided heart weakened the sum of faith. Addition represented service. Subtraction, disobedience. The children learned fractions through the parable of lost sheep. Her rules were simple, relentless, absolute. Some parents admired her. They said she kept the children disciplined, quiet, clean. Others whispered that she kept them afraid. Reverend Booker, of the First Baptist Church of Pineville, spoke of her once in a Sunday sermon. Some souls, he said gently, teach salvation as if it were mathematics, but the Almighty does not count. He forgives. The congregation nodded, though no one named her aloud. Pine County had already lost 2 teachers that year, one to influenza, one to a stillborn birth. Margaret never missed a day. Her letters from those years show both devotion and fatigue. The children lack boundaries, she wrote in 1931. I am the last fence before chaos. She described morning drills, a term that would later appear in the superintendent's file, attached to the first complaints. The drills began before sunrise. Children were made to stand in a circle and recite moral equations. Disobedience plus pride equals loss. Patience divided by envy equals peace. The exercises lasted an hour, sometimes two. The punishment known as the still hour appeared next. A student who lied, or failed to memorize, was made to sit alone in silence while the class recited scripture. The door was closed. No sound was permitted. Margaret believed stillness cured disorder. Parents began writing letters, short, hesitant, almost apologetic. Our boy wakes at night and mumbles his lessons. The drills make the children afraid of morning. No reply was ever sent. The superintendent's office was underfunded and distant. The county ledger that year shows a note beside her name: reliable, faithful, minimal expense. The system favored endurance over concern. Margaret endured. By late summer of 1931, her handwriting changed. The neat loops turned narrow, hurried. She stopped recording attendance and began listing verses instead. On September 28th, she wrote a single line in the margin of her ledger: "A lesson unfinished invites chaos." 5 days later, the schoolhouse was locked from the inside. The first to notice was a farmhand bringing firewood. He knocked. No answer. The windows were covered with paper, again this time thick butcher paper, pasted from within, the chimney cold. When the sheriff pried the door open, the room was in perfect order. Desks aligned, slates wiped clean, the blackboard erased. The Bible lay open on the teacher's desk, the ink on its margin not yet dry. No sign of Margaret Ellis. No sign of the children. A search began that afternoon. The woods behind the school stretched 5 miles toward the Oconee River. Dogs were brought in. They followed a scent for half a mile before losing it at the creek. By dusk, torches flickered across the valley. Locals spoke in fragments. Someone had seen her at dawn near the churchyard. Someone else claimed the children had been walking east in pairs. Nothing was confirmed. When investigators from the state arrived, 3 days later, they documented everything. The ledgers, the handmade arithmetic book, the rows of tiny shoes lined beneath the benches. One detail caught their attention. The inside door handle showed no fingerprints. Only the outer brass knob bore smudges. Too faint to trace. The official report filed that October called it a case of collective disappearance, under unknown circumstances. But among the townspeople, other versions spread. Some said she led the children into the woods to await divine instruction. Others said she crossed the river, intending to reach Macon, and was taken by the flood. A few whispered that she'd been punished for tampering with sacred order, that her moral arithmetic had called down its own correction. Decades later, a historian visiting Pine County uncovered a final note in the archive. It was tucked between the pages of the Book of Moral Arithmetic, written in faint pencil. The handwriting matched Margaret's. It read, "When the sum cannot be balanced, the slate must be cleared." The book remains in the county collection, its pages brittle, ink faded to sepia. No trace of the missing children was ever found. No family claimed her belongings. In 1957, the courthouse records were partially lost in a fire. Only the photograph survived Margaret, outside the courthouse. Parasol raised against the light, her eyes fixed on something just beyond the frame. For nearly a century, the photograph has been passed from archivist to archivist, each noting the same thing, the faint blur of movement behind her, as if someone small had just stepped out of view. The story of the woman from Macon endures not for what is known, but for what remains absent. A teacher's devotion turned doctrine, a ledger without an ending, a locked door with no hand to close it, and when the investigators dusted that room for prints, they found none at all on the inside handle. The red hollow schoolhouse still stands barely, the wood bowed, the roof pitched, the paint stripped to bone. Locals say the foundation was uneven as a coffin lid, and they mean it. It was built in 1889 by freedmen carpenters, a generation determined to carve permanence from soil that had never offered it. Their work was honest, but rushed. The ground beneath the structure was soft, and every season it sank a little deeper into itself. After the influenza epidemic of 1918, the schoolhouse emptied. The dead outnumbered the living that year, and Red Hollow folded back into silence. For a decade, wind moved through its halls unchecked. The windows shattered, vines split the boards, and the chalkboard turned gray with mildew. No one expected it to open again. Then, in 1924, a woman from Macon arrived. Her name was Margaret Ellis. She cleaned it alone. Records from the Pine County Historical Commission describe how she used lye to scrub the floors until her hands blistered, how she painted the walls a pale cream to reflect the light of virtue. She fixed the windows with panes ordered through the Georgia Department of Education's Rural Division and requested 32 readers, 12 primers, and 1 arithmetic set. When asked for the school's name, she wrote in neat handwriting, "God's Workshop." Neighbors watched her walk to the school each morning at dawn, parasol folded, ledger tucked under her arm. She spoke to no one, but when she did, she spoke as if narrating a lesson. A local farmer once said she could make you feel examined without saying a word. By the fall of 1930, her students' children of field hands, mill workers, and widows had memorized large sections of the Gospel of Matthew. They could recite entire chapters without a stumble. Arithmetic came next, timed not by clock but by bell. Witnesses said the sound of that bell carried through the pine woods long after sunset, sometimes after the children had already gone home. Some swore it was still ringing when they woke. That winter, the weather broke. A drought settled over Red Hollow, cracking the creek beds, silting the wells. Margaret stopped attending Sunday service. She said the sermons lacked discipline. People noticed her handwriting change in the church, letter tight, urgent, slanted as if the words leaned toward something unseen. Around this time, she began writing letters. Long, deliberate, addressed to an entity called the Board of Divine Instruction. No one in the county had heard of such an organization. None of her correspondences bear a return address, though her tone suggests she believed she was reporting progress. Red Hollow is awakening. One surviving letter reads, "The figures align with faith. Obedience yields result. Something shifted. The children's recitations grew longer, more precise. Margaret demanded silence before every lesson. She said the soul could not calculate under noise. A few older students left. Most stayed. Their parents said they'd never seen such discipline. Their eyes stayed lowered even at home. In August, Dr. Charles Merriweather, the town physician, made a visit to the school. The entry in his medical log is brief. Children appear underfed, fatigued, though orderly. Teacher requested tonic for spiritual lethargy. Declined my medical inspection. He later told his wife, the air inside the classroom was wrong like a church after midnight. He said, 2 weeks before the incident, the Pineville General Store received an order for 5 oil lamps and 6 gallons of kerosene, placed under her name. The clerk recalled. She smiled politely and said they were for a final evening lesson. He assumed she meant the autumn term. The surviving blackboard, now preserved in the Georgia State Archive, still bears faint chalk marks layered over each other. Arithmetic scrawled through scripture, as if the two were meant to merge. 3 + 1 = salvation. 12 divided by 1 = unity. 13 to 1 = completion. The archivists say you can see where the chalk pressed deeper, as though her hand shook mid-equation. In September, the drought worsened. The creek ran dry, and the townsfolk began to whisper that Margaret had been chosen for something beyond teaching. One farmer said he'd seen her standing in the field at dusk, facing the schoolhouse, lips moving soundlessly. Another claimed she buried a small box near the well, though when he returned later, the ground showed no sign of disturbance. Her attendance records for that month list 12 names. Each entry ends with a check mark and a single note. Accounted. 4. On the morning of September 30th, a neighbor heard singing from the direction of the schoolhouse. Not hymns, but numbers, soft voices chanting in unison. 1 + 1 + 1 + 1, over and over, until the sound faded. That evening, the bell tolled 13 times. No one in Red Hollow had ever heard it ring that long. 2 days later, the schoolhouse windows were covered from the inside. Paper, cloth, even slates nailed across the frames. A faint glow seeped through at night, steady, not flickering, as though the lamps burned continuously. The last person to see her alive was a delivery boy from the Pineville store. He'd come to drop off the oil lamps she'd ordered, he said. She met him at the door, face pale, eyes steady. When he asked if she needed help carrying them in, she shook her head. The lesson must be finished, she said. All sums must close. No one entered the building again until the investigation began. The sheriff's report, dated October 3rd, 1931, records what they found. The desks arranged in perfect rows, chalk neatly stacked, the air heavy with the scent of oil and lye. On the blackboard, those same equations. On the floor, a pattern drawn in chalk circles, like a geometry lesson too intricate for children. In the corner, 12 small chairs, and one more. The county ledger listed 12 children enrolled that fall, but 13 were found inside. No record identifies the 13th. No parent came forward. The coroner's report mentions one child of unconfirmed origin, though the physical description matches none of the enrolled names. The photographs from the scene, though rarely shown, reveal a peculiar detail. The 13th desk hand, like the others, was not of county issue. It was smaller, older, carved by hand. On its underside, faint initials, MEWHEN. State investigators cataloged the artifacts. They noted that the oil lamps were still half full, wicks unburnt. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of fire or collapse, only stillness. The blackboard was removed and stored at the Georgia State Archive. Years later, under ultraviolet examination, faint pencil markings were found beneath the chalk equations, notations, written in the same script as Margaret's personal ledgers. One phrase repeated 3 times. All numbers returned to 1. The schoolhouse decayed slowly after that. Locals refused to go near it. The bell was taken down, though some claim they still hear it on windless nights, tolling 13 times. When the historian from the University of Georgia visited in 1968, he noted the foundation still uneven. He described the structure as a building that seems to breathe from the ground up. The walls bowed inward, as if the weight inside never left. Today, the Red Hollow Schoolhouse remains fenced off. The county calls it unsafe, but the pine woods around it are silent in a way that's difficult to explain. Even birds avoid the rafters. The story of Margaret Ellis could have ended with her disappearance, but the evidence, the letters, the arithmetic, the 13th name, suggests something else. A woman who sought order so fiercely she may have stepped beyond the threshold of human reason. What remains of the sums she left behind? equations that tried to balance morality against flesh. 3 + 1 = salvation. 12 divided by 1 = unity. 13 to 1 = completion. No one ever corrected her arithmetic, and no one ever found the missing sum. The red hollow schoolhouse smelled of oil and lye when Sheriff James Reed entered it for the first time. The morning light struggled through the cracks, turning the dust into a slow, living haze. Every desk stood neatly aligned except one, a small, unpainted table at the back of the room. It was newer than the rest. It stood still pale, unstained by years of use. On its surface lay a single slate, faint writing visible beneath a film of chalk dust. ER followed by the phrase, "You are late." The sheriff noted it carefully in his report, filed October 4th, 1931. Desk 13. No name carved, no record of assignment. Slate inscribed with unknown initials. His handwriting was steady, though later he would admit that the room felt wrong too still for what it held. 12 names appeared on the county register that year. 12 children buried in the Pineville Cemetery, each marked by identical wooden crosses. None bore the initials ERWHEN. Questioned, the parents denied knowledge of a 13th pupil. One mother said her son spoke once of the quiet boy who sat near the door. Another recalled her daughter insisting she wasn't last in line. The other one went after her. Reed dismissed it as confusion. The tragedy had fractured everyone's memory. Still, the small desk remained a proclaimer, presence without record. Dr. Charles Merriweather, who performed the examinations, recorded his findings with unusual precision. All 12 subjects exhibit mild cyanosis, he wrote. Oxygen deprivation, but no physical trauma, no sign of poison, no residue in blood or stomach. He described the children's faces as calm, near sleeping. Their hands folded, posture composed, no sign of struggle. Margaret Ellis's body, however, told another story. Her lungs were blackened with soot, though the schoolhouse showed no trace of fire. Her fingertips were locked around a brass key, tendons rigid. On her desk, a Bible lay open to Proverbs 10:17. He is in the way of life that keepeth instruction. The page was smudged by ash. The sheriff's photograph of that desk shows her handwriting faintly visible in the margins, as if she had tried to underline the verse but her hand had trembled. The ink bled into the paper, pooling where her pen paused. Reed's deputy recalled another detail. The classroom stove was warm to the touch, though no wood burned inside it. The ashes were sifted, almost powdered, too fine to come from timber. They sent a sample to the county lab, but the results were inconclusive. By afternoon, the bodies were moved. The desks remained exactly as they were. Only the 13th stood apart, its surface clean except for the slate. Reed collected it as evidence, wrapping it in brown paper. But when the package arrived at the county office, 2 days later, the slate was blank. No initials? No message? That night, the sheriff dreamed of the room again. He wrote in his journal later, found among his effects after his death, something unseen sat at that desk, watching, waiting. The investigation closed within the month. Official cause of death, undetermined asphyxia. No charges, no surviving suspect. The county sealed the building for sanitary and moral reasons. But the stories continued. In late October, a farmer who claimed he saw a small boy walking toward the schoolhouse at dusk, barefoot, humming. The boy disappeared behind the pines. No one saw him leave. Days later, children passing on their way to church said they heard tapping inside, like chalk against a slate. The sheriff ordered the door nailed shut. When winter came, the groundskeeper, a quiet man named Amos Lee, was sent to board up the windows. He arrived near sunset, carrying a hammer and kerosene lamp. The air was cold, the sky low and gray. As he stepped inside, he heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, moving across the floorboards. He froze. The sound stopped. When he turned to leave, the lamp flickered out. He ran. Later that night, he returned only to find the light inside still burning. He left it that way. Over the next decade, the story of the 13th desk spread through Pine County like folklore. Some said the boy with the initials ER was an orphan Margaret had taken in without reporting. Others believed he was imaginary, a manifestation of her guilt, or perhaps her faith turned to fever. Yet the handwriting on that slate, the phrase, "You are late," appeared again in later accounts. In 1947, a group of local boys dared each other to enter the schoolhouse. They found a slate lying in the dust near the back. Those same words faintly visible. By 1958, the case resurfaced when state historian Dr. Helen Crandall reviewed the autopsy notes while compiling a report on rural Georgia tragedies. Her analysis raised questions. The pattern of asphyxia, she wrote, suggests oxygen displacement, possibly a chemical or environmental anomaly. Yet the absence of fire or gas leak contradicts this. The soot in the teacher's lungs remains the only combustion evidence. No logical sequence reconciles these findings. Dr. Crandall visited Pine County that summer. Locals still refused to speak of the schoolhouse. The building stood behind a gate, vines thick around its frame. When she peered through a gap in the boards, she saw something strange. A faint chalk mark still visible on the wall near the back desk. The letter E, nothing more. Her notes mention the smell dry wood and something else, faint, like kerosene long evaporated. The county kept the file sealed for another decade. But in 1972, a team from the University of Georgia's Department of Folklore Studies reopened the case. They were documenting rural myths of vanished children. Red Hollow was listed under moral hauntings, cases where religious instruction intersected with disappearance. The team arrived in September. The building was collapsing by then, its roof sagging, the bell missing. They pried up the floorboards near the rear desk, where the boards had warped. Beneath them, they found writing etched directly into the subfloor, faint but legible, carved with something sharp. The words read, "The sum is wrong. One remains." Beneath it, a small drawing, a circle divided into 12 sections, the 13th, marked with an X. The etchings were photographed, catalogued, then sealed again under glass. The county refused further excavation. One of the students, years later, claimed that the carvings appeared deeper than wood grain should allow, as if burned into place rather than scratched. When the report was published, it mentioned no supernatural. Conclusion. Only this line. The evidence suggests that belief, once absolute, can reorder reality itself. The 13th desk now rests in storage at the Georgia Historical Archive, tagged but unlisted in public records. Archivists note that though it never seems to gather dust, visitors report a faint hum when standing near it, like a breath drawn just before a word. The initials ER were never traced. No birth, no census, no record of a child by that name in Pine County or any neighboring district between 1920 and 1931. Yet the handwriting on that slate matched the style of every other student's script, awkward, uneven, undeniably human. Some historians believe Margaret invented him. Others think he was real, a child who arrived one day and never left. But in Red Hollow, the elders still tell it differently. They say the 13th desk was never empty, that someone always sat there, unseen, keeping count. When you walk by the ruins today, the air carries that same quiet rhythm, as if something is still tallying, still correcting, still waiting for the final sum to close. And beneath the floorboards, the words remain, the final message carved into the wood nearly a century ago. The sum is wrong. One remains. The boards beneath the teacher's platform had warped over time, thin gaps, breathing dust each time the door opened, sighing beneath the boots of anyone who dared walk across them. It was during the restoration of Red Hollow Schoolhouse in the summer of 1972 that one of those boards cracked, revealing a hollow no larger than a bread box. Inside, a bundle wrapped in wax paper, brittle, tied with twine so old it had fused into the folds. The air turned cold when it was opened. The ledger inside was preserved better than expected. Its cover was soft, almost oily to the touch, the edges darkened with soot. The handwriting on the first page, Margaret Weaver's. The ink faint, the letters careful, deliberate, each entry dated, each one marked with a lesson number, as if meant for her class. September 28, 1931. Lesson 7, Fear. Her handwriting that day looked strong, anchored. She wrote of weather turning colder, of the children's restlessness. There are whispers during arithmetic, she noted, but no one claims them. On the opposite margin, a faint smudge of graphite perhaps, from a student's slate. Yet the mark curved like a fingertip dragged across wet ash. The next page. September 29th. Lesson 8. Faith. Her tone grew unsettled. The children will not meet my eyes, she wrote. At roll call, one voice answered that was not upon the list. That same line was underlined twice, the second stroke shakier, as though she hesitated to finish it. Beneath a small ink blot formed a shape almost human, like a head bowed in prayer. For historians, these early entries read as the slow unraveling of a mind strained by isolation. But for those who have stood inside the Red Hollow schoolroom, there is something else in the Inca rhythm that feels too ordered to be madness. Each lesson followed a pattern, each emotion escalating as if rehearsed. September 30th. Lesson 9. Obedience. Margaret described the class singing hymns between lessons. The lyrics, she said, were not from our book, yet every mouth moved in time. That line disturbed Dr. Crandall when she reviewed it decades later, calling it a glimpse into collective dissociation. But even she could not explain the next sentence. The 13th desk was filled today. No records of such a desk existed. No, Carpenter recalled adding one. Yet Margaret wrote, as though it had always been there, and as though the missing voice from the previous day had finally taken its seat. October 1st. Lesson 10. Silence. That entry carried a coldness even on paper. Her script had tightened, her spacing narrowed. She wrote, "Children restless today, one absent, yet present in voice, shall proceed with unity." The word unity appeared darker, pressed deep into the page, as if carved, rather than written. A tear stain confirmed by forensic testing, decades later, distorted the line just below it. By the final entry, October 2nd, her letters trembled. The number aligns. We are whole. The lesson must not be interrupted. Then a gap. Empty space, half a page of silence. And beneath it, handwriting that wasn't hers. The same sentence, written 12 times over, each line more frantic than the last. Teacher, we are ready. Forensic graphologists at the Atlanta State Laboratory confirmed 2 distinct writing pressures. Margaret's measured, looping, and another, heavier, with sharp descenders that cut through the page. No ink in the building matched that second hand. When Dr. Helen Crandall examined the ledger in 1958, she noted that the darker writing had oxidized differently, as if made from a pigment unknown to standard. Inks of the 1930s. Its sheen under ultraviolet light reflected more like soot than dye. Yet the ledger itself smelled faintly sweet, like candle wax and old wood smoke. Crandall proposed what she called the Red Hollow delusion. Her report suggested that Margaret, isolated in the hills with a dozen children, succumbed to a religious mania possibly triggered by the economic despair of the Great Depression and reinforced by their collective dependence on her authority. She theorized that the lessons represented a self-fashioned liturgy: fear, faith, obedience, silence, deliverance, a progression toward submission. But even Crandall hesitated in her conclusion. The 13th presence, she wrote, remains unaccounted for. No child by that number existed. Others who handled the ledger mentioned sensations that could not be filed in any report. The faint hum of vibration when the book was opened, the way candlelight bent against its surface. One archivist, unnamed in the official logs, refused to store it in the university archives, claiming it spoke when the room was empty. When the wax paper was rewrapped and sealed again, the custodian in charge of cataloging the find swore that the ink on the final page looked darker than when first opened, like something still wet, still breathing. Across the decades, the ledger became less a document than a testimony, one that refused to end. Researchers argued over Margaret's sanity, her faith, her guilt. The 12 repetitions of "Teacher, we are ready" became a cultural cipher, cited in local sermons, printed in small-town newspapers, even whispered in dormitory halls of the University of Georgia, where folklore students dared each other to read it aloud. Yet none of them noticed the faint indentation beneath the final line, only visible under raking light. It wasn't writing, more like the trace of something that had pressed through from beneath. When imaging technicians later enhanced it, a word emerged. Fragmented, but legible. Light. Some believed Margaret's lessons had been a desperate attempt to protect her pupils, to teach them obedience in the face of something beyond comprehension. Others saw her as the instigator of their fate, but the ledger offered no resolution, only the echo of ritual. In 1972, when the Department of Folklore Studies reopened the case, they used spectrographic analysis to compare ink residues on all 5 entries. The results contradicted every assumption. The darker ink, the one no source could match, wasn't ink at all. It was carbon. Human carbon. The residue of something burned. Who or what had written with it? No one could say. The pages were sealed again in archival glass, now stored in a temperature-controlled vault. Yet, according to an internal memo, one of the interns claimed that, after handling it, she found a single word smudged onto her palm: deliverance. Margaret Weaver's handwriting ended there, abruptly, as if interrupted mid, and perhaps that was the truest record of all. Not madness, not miracle, but a teacher continuing her duty even as the light around her dimmed. What remains beneath that floor, beneath the wax, beneath the decades of speculation, is a question that refuses burial. The ink was not of this world. The words were written by more than one hand, and when the ledger is opened, even under glass, it still smells faintly of fire. No ink source on site matched the darker writing. The reel begins with static, a faint hum of tape spinning, a man's voice measured, southern, weary, from repetition testing the microphone. This is Harold Linton, recording for the Public Broadcasting Service. Interview, Red Hollow investigation, July 1973. Then, silence. For nearly 4 decades, the town had refused to speak. The schoolhouse had become more rumor than ruin, a place children dared each other to approach on Halloween. Its windows covered with tin, its foundation sinking into clay. But Linton came armed with a camera, a rented crew, and a promise that he only wanted history, not belief, not ghosts, just truth. He found little of it. The surviving families were scattered across counties, most changing their names, some claiming not to remember Red Hollow at all. Out of 21 known relatives, Only one agreed to meet him, an 81-year-old woman named Clara Reeve. She lived alone in a clapboard house on the outskirts of Dalton, Georgia, where the wallpaper curled like parchment and the radio stayed on through the night. Clara's sister, Lottie, had been one of the 12 children in Margaret Weaver's class. On the tape, her voice trembles through age and grief. Mama said Miss Ellis kept saying she'd teach them to listen, even when the world went silent. The phrasing disturbed Linton. Miss Ellis Margaret's maiden name appeared nowhere in the surviving documents. Clara claimed that her mother had always used it, as though Margaret had been someone else before she was a teacher. Linton's notes, preserved in a gray folder now housed in the PBS archives, mention that Clara refused to speak further after that line. She looked toward the window and said, she didn't mean it cruel. She just wanted them quiet enough to hear him. When pressed, she didn't clarify who him was. Linton titled his unfinished documentary, The Lesson of 13. He filmed local landscapes, the cracked bell tower, the field where the school once stood, a nearby creek where toys and shoes were reportedly found. But the footage was never broadcast. Internal memos from PBS's legal department, uncovered decades later, cited unverifiable religious content and emotional distress of living witnesses as reasons for shelving the project. The negatives were stored in a vault, labeled restricted, yet one frame was missing. A still image shows Linton standing inside the schoolhouse before restoration, one hand resting on the teacher's desk. Behind him, faint in the shadows, appears the outline of a small figure near the back wall. In 1982, nearly a decade later, Dr. Helen Crandall, the same historian who had first examined the ledger, published her final paper, Pedagogy in Possession, The Red Hollow Anomaly. It was printed in a regional academic journal, quickly withdrawn, then circulated quietly among folklore circles. Her argument was not one of haunting, but of history. She described Margaret's teachings as a form of obedience doctrine, a warped theology common to isolated Depression-era communities. Crandall wrote that when faith becomes discipline and discipline becomes salvation, children stop learning and start waiting. She connected Red Hollow to other anomalies of the era, like the 1929 Elder Creek congregation in Mississippi, where a pastor convinced his flock that arithmetic could predict deliverance, numbers as prophecy, silence as devotion. Her conclusion was clinical. Margaret's class had become a closed system of belief, their lessons mutating into ritual. But her tone betrayed something more personal. In the margins of one surviving draft, she scribbled, they weren't delusional or prepared when Crandall petitioned for access to the original coroner's files, hoping to cross-reference handwriting samples and autopsy data. County clerk reported the records missing. Sheriff Reed's report, his signed statement, and all photographic evidence of the scene had vanished from official storage. The only remaining artifact, a line item in the 1931 expense ledger, listing 13 child-sized caskets, delivered October 6th. Crandall continued her research until her death in 1985, though those who knew her said she grew increasingly withdrawn, refusing to discuss Red Hollow publicly. Her last lecture notes ended with a single phrase, "The 13th never left." Years passed. The story faded again into myth. Then, in the summer of 1991, lightning struck the abandoned schoolhouse. Witnesses saw the building glow from within before it caught flame, as though something inside had been waiting for ignition. Fire crews arrived too late. The walls collapsed inward, burning slow and blue. No accelerant was detected. Investigators called it an act of nature. Locals disagreed. They claimed the blaze burned too long to clean. For nearly 6 hours, the schoolhouse smoldered, the air thick with the smell of brass and ash. When the remains cooled, a county work crew arrived to clear debris. Beneath the place where the teacher's desk had once stood, they uncovered a crawl space sealed by warped planks. Inside lay a scatter of small, metallic fragments, fused together by heat. When separated, they revealed themselves as keys. 13 of them, each identical, each stamped with no initials, no number, only a small, engraved ring at the bow, as if meant to hang from a chain. The fragments were sent to the state lab for analysis. The report came back inconclusive. Brass composition, mid-century manufacture, not contemporary to 1931, but all showing signs of long-term exposure to high heat prior to the fire. The official file noted, possible artifacts of earlier origin, function unknown. Unofficially, one of the men who handled them claimed that, when the last key was lifted, a thin residue, black and oily, streaked the palm of his glove. The same residue that forensic teams decades earlier had found on Margaret's ledger. The Red Hollow case was closed for the third and final time that year. The land was sold to a timber company, the foundations leveled, but nothing ever grew there. The soil tested sterile, the groundwater tinted faint gray. For Harold Linton, the man who had once tried to tell the story truthfully, the aftermath was quieter, but no less haunting. He resigned from PBS in 1974, citing creative exhaustion. In an interview years later, he admitted that his tapes were incomplete not because of censorship, but because several reels had gone missing. When asked how many, he paused. 13, he said, then laughed, as if the number had chosen itself. When those tapes resurfaced in 2001 during digitization, the final relabeled, Simply Clara contained 47 seconds of audio hiss, followed by a woman's whisper barely audible through distortion. The key fits all doors, but not the living. The sound technician who transcribed it refused to replay it, claiming the tape breathed. That whisper became the last documented trace of Red Hollow, before the archives sealed the collection indefinitely. Some historians argue the keys were symbolic, a teacher's metaphor for virtue or knowledge. Others believe they were literal part of a lesson, or a ritual, meant to bind or unlock. No one knows where the originals are now. They disappeared sometime after 1993. Catalog tags cut clean from the vault. Still, the pattern persists. Each attempt to document the case ends in silence, loss, or fire. Linton's film was never aired. Crandall's article was withdrawn. Reed's report was erased. And yet, the story endures, in the ledger, in the soot, in the echo of that whisper. The key fits all doors, but not the living. When the ground was last surveyed, a geologist recorded magnetic fluctuations directly beneath where the teacher's platform once stood. The reading pulsed exactly 13 times before leveling. What burned in Red Hollow was not just a building. It was the memory of instruction, of a teacher who promised her students they would learn to listen. Even when the world went silent, the fire exposed the crawlspace. The crawlspace revealed the keys, and the keys, when counted, made the number whole again. 13. The keys were smaller than anyone expected. 2 inches long, dull brass, their edges smoothed by years of handling. Each engraved with a number 1 through 30 and arranged in a perfect circle when found beneath the teacher's desk. No keyholes nearby, no locks, just the keys, like a completed equation left behind for someone else to solve. When Harold Linton cataloged them in 1973, he wrote a single line in his field notebook, 13 symbols of entry yet no door. The phrase repeated again in his later notes, written, shakier, as if he had begun to doubt his own words. One of his interviews provides the first human trace of their origin. A retired Pineville deputy, name withheld, remembered the autumn before. The tragedy? He said Margaret Ellis often kept her pupils after class, said each one needed to earn their key before October. He thought she meant it figuratively, a teacher's way of speaking about responsibility. But the children, he said, carried small envelopes home, and the sound of metal sometimes clinked inside. No, parent reported receiving one. By the time of the incident, none of the envelopes remained. Margaret's diary, half lost, half restored through microfilm and fragments found in the Georgia State Archive, offered what scholars now call the arithmetic theology, a merging of scripture and calculation, of faith and order. She wrote, "When the sum equals his name, the door will close itself." To her, numbers were not symbols of logic. They were sacred alignments, each lesson a progression toward something invisible, precise, and final. She referred to her method as the final arithmetic. The diary pages preserved are meticulous, each line dated ink, consistent until the final entry. There she writes, "They have learned to count beyond 12. Margaret's cousin, Sarah Weaver, interviewed in 1974, claimed her obsession began earlier, after a revival meeting in Macon, around 1929. She talked about Revelation all the time, Sarah recalled, especially the part where he opens a door no man can shut. Said that meant the faithful must find the door before it closes on them." Scholars later identified her reference. Revelation 3:2-8, "I have set before thee an open door, and no man can shut it." Margaret wrote the verse repeatedly in her lesson plans, often beside multiplication tables. The association between divine order and numerical obedience had become her creed. Historians suggest she interpreted the passage literally, that she believed she and her students were preparing for a spiritual threshold. Psychologists, decades later, would call it messianic pedagogy syndrome, a rare delusional disorder among isolated educators in the pre-war South. But labels could not account for precision, for ritual, for the physicality of the keys. Each key was numbered, polished, deliberate, graved by hand, not machine, as if meant to be recognized by touch rather than sight. None matched local blacksmithing patterns of the era, and yet each fit together when laid flat, their bows aligning to form a perfect circle 13 in unity. The symbolism did not escape Linton. In his correspondence with Dr. Helen Crandall, dated November 1973, he speculated that the keys may have functioned as initiations, one for each lesson, the 13th mark in completion. Crandall disagreed. "Completion implies closure," she wrote. This was not closure. This was invitation. Then came the discovery that complicated everything. A telegram, sent from Pineville Post Office on October 2, 1931, the day before the tragedy. It bore Margaret's handwriting, addressed to the state superintendent in Atlanta. The text read simply, "All 13 accounted. Commencing lesson 11 tonight. Please witness." The transmission record confirmed it was received. No reply was sent. Archivists believe it to be the last message Margaret ever wrote. The telegram survived only because the Pineville Post Office retained carbon duplicates of all outgoing messages during that year. When researchers uncovered it in 1978, they noticed something peculiar. The ink density varied, as if written over twice. The word witness had been pressed harder, leaving faint indentation marks on the backing paper. Lesson 11, the entry Margaret mentioned, has never been found. In her recovered ledger, Lessons 7 through 10, fear, faith, obedience, silence, and abruptly. The page where 11 should begin is torn clean across the binding. Forensic analysis revealed no knife marks, no burn residue, suggesting it was removed before the fire. The missing lesson became a fixation for investigators, historians, and theologians alike. What could it have been? Deliverance was marked as Lesson 12. If the final step was deliverance, then 11 must have been preparation in act, not a lecture. Some speculate it was a ritual of unity. Others call it confession. Dr. Crandall once suggested that Lesson 11 was not taught to the children, but through them that Margaret saw herself as the 13th key. Completing the circle, what remains certain is this: by the night of October 2, all 13 keys existed. The next morning, the schoolhouse door was locked from the outside. Linton's research describes one chilling observation made by an unnamed witnesser, farmer's son, aged 10 at the time. He recalled walking past the schoolhouse before sunrise and seeing light flickering from the windows. Not candlelight, something steadier, like lanterns lined in a ring, he said. And I heard counting. Slow, steady counting. Up to 13. Then nothing. The number appears again and again. 13 desks. 13 names in the ledger. 13 brass keys beneath the floor. 13 entries in the telegram log before it went silent. The repetition became almost mathematical, as if Margaret had rewritten the structure of her classroom into something closed and perfecter. Circle that could not be broken. The recovered key fragments from the 1991 fire reveal another mystery. Metallurgists dated their engraving process to around 1910, 20 years before Red Hollow opened. It means the keys existed long before Margaret arrived. The implication unsettled historians. Either she discovered them and built her teaching around their symbolism, or she forged her own replacements for something older. Something she believed she was continuing rather than creating. In 2004, a private collector claimed to possess one surviving key. The photographs show corrosion along the stem and faint soot trapped inside the ring. The engraved number is 11. The key was lost again before analysis could be verified. If authentic, it may have been the missing artifact, the key to the missing lesson. Those who have studied the case describe the same uneasy symmetry. A teacher driven by order, children shaped into symbols, and objects designed to lock something unseen. Yet no lock was ever found. The only door mentioned in her writings was metaphorical, the one no man can shut. Perhaps Margaret believed she was preserving her students, ensuring they crossed through some invisible threshold intact. Or perhaps she mistook silence for salvation, mistook numbers for souls. The final line of her surviving diary reads, "He shall know them by their measure." When read aloud, it sounds less like scripture and more like instruction. What, she counted. That night what she believed the arithmetic completed remains unknown. But every record, every remnant, every echo from that small schoolhouse seems to end the same way. A closed door, a circle of 13, and the faint glint of brass in. The dark lesson 11 has never been found. The reel had no label, no index number, just a cracked metal canister, its lid rusted to the edge, and a faint smell of acetate and dust. Daniel Webb almost ignored it. He was deep in the Georgia State University archive, sifting through boxers of unused educational material from the 1930s. The reel was found wedged between agricultural footage plowing demonstrations, cotton grading tutorials, the dull rhythm of rural documentation. When Webb lifted it to the light, a handwritten note appeared faintly on the inner rim. Lesson 11. The handwriting was small, hurried, almost etched into the metal with a nail. He threaded the reel through the Steenbeck veer, switched on the bulb, and what flickered to life was not what anyone expected to find. A schoolroom, waltz, light cutting through slanted windows. Dust motes drift like ash. 12 children in identical posture backs, straight hands clasped, eyes closed. One desk empty in the front row. There is no sound at first, only the faint hiss of the film's magnetic track. Then, after 6 seconds, a voice, female, calm, measured, southern. Silence is the proof of understanding. The phrase repeats. Every 23 seconds. Each time, the same tone, the same deliberate pacing, as if meant for memorization. Webb leaned closer. The children never move. Only their breathing changes slow, synchronized. Like they've been taught to breathe on command. At times, stomp 142, the camera pans. A deliberate, sweeping motion across the room. No operator visible, but the framing is precise, intentional. On the blackboard, chalk letters fill the center. Lesson 11, Deliverance Through Stillness. The handwriting matches samples from Margaret. Ellis's lesson plans were covered decades earlier. The reel had no date on the leader, but along the film edge tiny. Perforation marks, barely visible, were the words, Eastman, Kodak, Safety Film. 1931. Kodak only used that particular marking for 1 year. The year of the Pineville incident. When Webb brought the footage to experts at the universities. Media Lab, they assumed it was part of an early teacher training program. But others, familiar with the Pineville case, saw something else. Each child matched descriptions from photographs taken before the tragedy. The same uniforms, the same room dimensions, even the same tilt in the front window frame the one documented. In fire inspection reports after 1931, the most disturbing part wasn't visual. It was the sound. Forensic analysts later confirmed that the audio track was layered, 2 nearly identical voice recordings. The primary voice female clearest cited the line as heard. The secondary track, delayed by exactly 4/10 of a second, whispered the same words again, softer, as if echoing from behind the microphone. The voices overlapped like prayer and response. At first, it seemed like an editing error. But the alignment was too precise, the timing too consistent. Webb's notes record his reaction. 2 voices speaking as one mind. The echo feels deliberate, instructional, like she wanted the children to hear both her and something behind her. The second voice could not be isolated. When engineers filtered frequencies, the whisper bled into static, untraceable, yet undeniably human. At timestamp 2:36, the film darkens, the lighting shifts. Shadows climb the walls as if the sun were setting in reverse. The blackboard begins to reflect light, unnaturally flat, metallic, like the chalk had been mixed with something reflective. Then the voice changes tone. Silence is the proof of understanding, she says again, but this time the delay grows longer. The second voice lags nearly half a second now, stretching the phrase into an echo that feels less like a repeat, more like pursuit. One of the children twitches. The boy in the second row, far right. His fingers move, folding tighter, but his eyes remain closed. At 3:01, the frame stutters, jumps, then continues. A sign of in-camera editing, not post-production. Someone had stopped, then resumed filming. When it resumes, the classroom looks darker. The children still sit perfectly still. But something feels off in the geometry, their arrangement tighter, the circle narrower. The empty desk remains, lit by the only window left uncovered. Experts noted the cinematography to steady for handheld. The camera was mounted, probably on a borrowed newsreel tripod. Pineville had no film equipment in 1931, but the local newspaper. Occasionally received training footage from Atlanta field offices. Margaret's telegram, sent October 2nd of that year, had requested an observer please witness. Some now think she meant a camera. Webb's discovery reanimated the question that had haunted the investigation for decades. What was Lesson 11? The chalkboard answered only in part, deliverance through stillness. But deliverance from what? Silence as a passage, or as a prison. At time stomp for 10, the frame freezes briefly. The children's expressions seem to change. Not fear, not peace, a state between both. Slowly, the camera pans again, this time toward the far left of the frame. The blackboard glows slightly from the reflection of the projector bulb in Webb's lab. There, faintly visible under the chalk text, are small etch marks numbers arranged vertically. 1 through 13. The 12th line is smudged. The 13th, untouched, in the margin, a faint circle, like a keyhole sketched in haste. When Webb tried to rewind that sequence, the film tore. That section, the transition between frame 447 and 448, was lost in the projector gate, but not before he saw the last image, the single frame that stopped the reel entirely, the 13th desk, occupied not by a child, just the outline of a figure. Pale in the dim light, head bowed, hands unseen beneath the desk. The exposure overexposed white where there should be color, but unmistakably human. The final frame burned slightly at the edges, a ring of heat where the bulb had held too long. That's how Webb described it later. The image seemed to resist being seen. Archivists later confirmed that the 13th desk had been found empty in all official photographs from 1931. No record of anyone sitting there. No trace of anyone ever assigned to it. Yet on the film, it is no longer empty. The forensic report noted another anomaly. The reel contained 482 frames, but the physical film length suggested 483. One missing frame. Removed deliberately, not torn. The spliceline was too clean. No. One knows what that frame showed. When Webb compared the reel's audio to known samples of Margaret Ellis's voice letters she had dictated years earlier as part of a rural teaching initiative, the waveform pattern matched by 82%. The second, delayed voice matched by 79%. Too close to coincidence, too imperfect for duplication. Both voices, it seemed, were hers. Analysts described it as self-overlap, a recording of one person speaking twice on top of themselves, with minute timing difference. It was technologically possible in 1931, but only through manual synchronization recording. Once, then replaying the audio through an additional microphone while speaking again. A technique requiring intention, not accident. She wanted her voice to echo. She wanted it to answer itself. Perhaps, as one psychologist suggested, Lesson 11 was meant as a final rehearsal and experiment in perfect obedience, in unison, a rehearsal for silence so complete it erased individuality. Others believed the recording was a warning, Margaret documenting the stillness that overtook her class before the end. Deliverance through stillness, the lesson of stopping. When Webb screened the footage for the historical committee, several viewers reported an inexplicable auditory illusion, a faint rhythmic pulse behind the voice, like distant footsteps or the closing of doors. The waveform showed nothing. The sound existed only in perception. By the time the film was officially catalogued, its provenance had been split into two theories. The university labeled it unverified educational film. 1931. The Pineville Historical Society listed it as probable artifact of the Ellis case. Both agreed on one point. It was the only moving image ever connected to the 13 keys. The following year, Webb began hearing from collectors. One, a retired projectionist from Savannah, claimed to have seen a similar reel decades earlier, labeled Lesson 12. But no copies surfaced. Only Lesson 11 remained damaged, half heard, half understood, and always ending the same way. The 13th desk, once empty, no longer so. Even today, archivists debate whether the reel captured the event itself or merely reenacted it. The clarity of the lens, the symmetry of the children's posture, the unblinking comet feels too composed for terror, too quiet for life. Webb's final note before sealing the canister back into storage read, "It doesn't feel like documentation. It feels like participation. No one has screened the reel publicly since." The metal case sits behind glass, labeled simply, GSU Reel 1931-11. The catalog entry ends with one line, "Audio incomplete, speaker unseen." And yet, those who have listened closely to the static swear they can still hear it. The whisper, 4/10 of a second late, repeating the words. Again and again, silence is the proof of understanding. In the winter of 2017, the Pine County Historical Society reopened the Red Hollow investigation. The initiative was led by curator Dr. Evelyn Carter, a quiet scholar, known for her precision, not her ambition. The exhibit was titled Faith and Silence, the Forgotten Classroom. The museum itself sat on the edge of Pineville's original town limits, a converted courthouse whose walls still smelled faintly of varnish and paper. The opening weekend drew little attention at first. A few local journalists, a handful of historians, and a small crowd of descendants from the families once tied to Red Hollow. Then the restoration began, projected in a darkened auditorium. On a new 4K digital scan, the 1931 reel returned to motion for the first time in nearly a century. The light flickered against the faces of the audience as Margaret Ellis's classroom appeared 12 children, one empty desk, and then, the voice.com. Southern silence is the proof of understanding. The sound was cleaner than expected, clearer than analog should allow. For a moment, the audience sat still, but as the reel ended and the lights rose, a faint echo seemed to linger, a whisper, buried in the air conditioning ducts. Acoustic engineers later dismissed it. They said the restored projector's frequency response, combined with the room's arched ceiling, had created a standing wave-on auditory illusion, a ghost tone. Yet multiple attendees described it the same way, a child's cadence, soft and synchronized, continuing after the reel had stopped. A week later, the exhibit went viral. Clips of the film spread across academic forums, drawing interest from universities abroad. Psycholinguists noted the phrasing. Theologians dissected the doctrine, and archivists questioned how the sound had survived so intact after 86 years of chemical decay. Local residents, however, wanted it gone. They petitioned the county to close the display, arguing that Red Hollow was not history, was ground that had never been properly laid to rest. The teacher's lesson ended, one man wrote, but the echo never did. Carter resisted. She saw the exhibit not as exploitation, but as completion, an attempt to let the story breathe one final time under controlled light. But her resolve began to fracture. After the second week, a visiting researcher from the University of North Carolina had brought a portable, ultraviolet scanner to re-examine the recovered ledger. Under the glow of shortwave light, faint impressions surfaced beneath the visible ink. Pressure marks words once written, then erased, yet not entirely gone. The letters formed a sentence. All but one obeyed. The line ran diagonally across the lower page. written so lightly it could only have been pressed by the edge of the nib, not the tip. The forensic team couldn't explain why the imprint appeared reversed, as if written from beneath the page, rather than atop it. Carter's notes from that night describe her reaction with measured restraint. If the ledger is authentic, this means one did not comply. One child resisted instruction. The implication changes everything. She requested new lab testing on the wax paper that had wrapped the ledger. Since its discovery in the 1970s, what came back 2 weeks later shifted the entire investigation. DNA extraction from the preserved folds revealed traces belonging to a male juvenile, aged approximately 10 to 12, not a known relative of Margaret Ellis, not a known student from the original rosters, an unidentified child. The sample was partial, degraded, but enough to confirm one thing. Someone else had touched the ledger after the lessons ended. Before the paper was sealed, the case file, briefly reopened, was immediately reclassified under Georgia State Code 45-9, a statute reserved for unresolved cases involving religious institutional trauma. Once enacted, all materials fell under restricted status, access revoked, all testing frozen. Publicly, Carter said little. The exhibit continued, though attendance dwindled. Local clergy condemned the display as an inversion of faith. One visitor was recorded whispering before the film began, "You don't teach silence, you invoke it." By the 4th week, the auditorium began showing signs of strain. The speakers emitted intermittent static, untraceable to the hardware. When technicians replaced the cables, the noise persisted, short bursts of interference, aligning precisely with the reel's original timestamps. When one engineer overlaid the noise pattern on the waveform from the 1931 recording, the pulses matched the second, delayed voice, the whisper track. Those present described a distinct moment of unease when the projector stopped. The light flicked out, and yet the sound did not end immediately. A final phrase, almost imperceptible, hung in the darkness. "Teacher, we are ready." No one could reproduce it afterward. Within days, rumors spread that the exhibit would close prematurely. Carter denied it in interviews, insisting that the display would remain through its scheduled run. But staff later recalled her growing distant, speaking less, staying late after hours to review archival footage alone. Security logs show she entered the exhibit room 13 times after closing over a 2-week period. Each time, the system recorded the same sequence. Main lights off, projector on for 6 minutes, then off again. She never explained why. The night before her resignation, Carter sent an internal memo to the society board. "There are sounds in the reel not made by the machine." The next morning, she was gone. Her office was found in order, keys returned. The only anomaly, a small brown parcel, postmarked 2 days earlier from Savannah, addressed in block letters, for Dr. Evelyn Carter. Inside, a single brass key, tarnished, but intact, numbered 13. No fingerprints recovered. The postal records traced only to a drop box. No sender identified. Carter's resignation letter was brief. Some histories are meant to remain unfinished. After her departure, the museum sealed the exhibit indefinitely. The remaining materials were transferred to state custody. The press release cited psychological distress among staff. But those who worked the cleanup recall one final detail. When the reel was removed from its case for storage, its metal canister bore new discoloration, darkened lines etched faintly around the rim. The marks formed a circle. Inside it, 13 INDENTATIONS. Technicians assumed it was corrosion from humidity. Yet the pattern was perfect, deliberate, the same alignment used in Margaret Ellis's classroom for the 13 keys. The final inventory listed 12 of those original keys accounted for. Only one was ever missing. Key 13, the one Carter had received no official record of the parcel exists. The museum denies ever logging it. The key itself vanished before the case files were sealed. For a brief time, digital copies of the restored film circulated among academic channels, until an order from the state's cultural board requested their takedown. The official reasoning: ethical concerns over exposure to unverified traumatic content. But still, fragments remain uploaded anonymously, archived in dark corners of the internet, each ending the same way: the flicker, the hum dot, and then that whisper. Layered in late, silence is the proof of understanding. Some claim that if you let the video run long enough past its official endpoint, you'll hear another sound beneath it, a faint, metallic click, as though a small key had finally turned. The land where Red Hollow once stood looks unremarkable now, an uncut pasture, framed by barbed wire and drought-stripped trees. No stone, no signpost, no shadow of the schoolhouse that once sat there. Only the wind, carrying the faint rattle of loose tin from a distant barn. It is a silence so complete it almost feels intentional. A century has passed since the tragedy. Records have been lost, repurposed, or quietly destroyed. The county line was redrawn, the road renamed. In official documents, Red Hollow is a clerical ghost, something that appears in none of the maps, yet haunts every archive. The absence itself has become the artifact, but fragments survive. A child's handwriting sample stored in a museum drawer, sealed in glass, to prevent further fading. The strokes are steady, almost too disciplined for a hand so small. A single line repeats 3 times in graphite: "I will listen to be free." Another fragment, a slate board, half burned, with a corner melted smooth as river stone. And the ledger, always the ledger. Faded ink, uneven script, the ghost of a hand pressing too hard, as if trying to be remembered by force. In recent decades, psychologists have studied the Red Hollow case under different lenses: isolation-induced, hysteria, rural obedience, culture, authoritarian pedagogy. They label it an educational convergence failure, a collapse where faith and fear shared the same face. Yet every theory ends the same way, with a pause, and then the same unspoken question: how far can devotion go before it becomes destruction? Dr. Evelyn Carter, who once reopened the case, described it as a spiritual algorithm, a sequence of obedience and silence, encoded into generations. "You can hear it," she said once, "in classrooms that value order over curiosity, in prayers that demand stillness before understanding." Red Hollow never ended, it just evolved. Her papers were later withdrawn from publication. Margaret Ellis remains the center of it all, a figure both revered and condemned. To some, she was a woman overtaken by conviction. To others, the first martyr of misplaced faith. Her own obituary, printed in the Macon Telegraph in 1932, spares judgment. Devoted teacher, faithful unto death. 2 sentences to contain a life that unmade 13 others. Her final letter, however, refuses closure. Addressed to the Board of Divine Instruction, it ends with a line still debated by historians and theologians. Alike, the door is shut, but the lesson continues. Some read it as repentance, others as defiance. To a few, it is a prophecy suggesting that what happened in that single-room schoolhouse was not an ending, but a beginning. That obedience, once learned, never fully leaves the human mind. When scholars reconstructed the final weeks of the school, they found records of strange behavior among the children: synchronized recitations without instruction, prolonged silences during lessons, and notes written in margins by multiple hands, phrases repeating the teacher's words, as though echoing her thoughts, a pattern emerging across time. One researcher described it as the contagious geometry of submission. Even now, the surviving fragments carry the residue of intention. The ink on the ledger fluoresces faintly under ultraviolet light, revealing invisible imprints beneath the visible text, letters pressed hard enough to leave second-hand words. One phrase stands out, all but one, obeyed. Forensic linguists claim it was written after the original entry, perhaps days later, perhaps by another hand. There are no names for the 13 students. The records of rural Georgia schools in the 1930s were rarely meticulous, especially in districts with collapsing budgets and religious oversight. But a census log from 1930 lists 12 children of school age in Red Hollow Township, 12 and no more. The arithmetic does not match the evidence. The 13th seat, the one scene occupied in the final frame of the recovered film, remains unclaimed. When the footage was digitally restored, analysts noted something peculiar. The final panning shot intended, perhaps, to capture the classrooms. Simplicity moves past each child, then lingers slightly on the last desk. A subtle light shift, a flicker on the lens. Experts call it artifacting, a trick of exposure. Yet one frame later, the seat is no longer empty. What it shows instead is a faint shape, a blur at shoulder height, half-formed but present. A residue of motion caught between film grains. The restoration team avoided public comment, but their internal memo leaked a year later. It described unaccounted optical variants suggesting unregistered subject movement. No one used the word apparition, though several avoided returning to the editing suite. Psychologists studying the case now use Red Hollow as metaphor, a story to warn about the dangers of blind instruction. They call it the obedience paradox, where control masquerades as safety and faith substitutes for comprehension. The lesson, they say, is timeless, that silence, mistaken for peace, can become the most destructive form of compliance. But not everyone accepts that conclusion. Some view Margaret's teachings as early cognitive discipline, an attempt to regulate emotion through spiritual quietude. Deliverance through stillness, she called it. Her philosophy may have predated modern mindfulness by decades, though twisted by the fervor of isolation and unmoderated belief. A letter from a neighboring teacher, discovered in a private archive, describes Margaret's final month. She has taken 2 long pauses before speaking, as if measuring each word against some invisible weight. Her pupils mirror her stillness so much that one forgets they are children at all. The idea that devotion could consume intellect is not new, but Red Hollow condensed it into a single, unforgettable equation. It asked, what is the cost of obedience when the teacher herself becomes the lesson? In the century that followed, schools, churches, and even corporate training programs have unknowingly replicated the structure, rewarding compliance, discouraging doubt, mistaking quiet for understanding. The same pattern, modernized. Different buildings, same silence. The story of Red Hollow isn't just about faith or madness, it's about inheritance. The psychological echo of obedience passed down through generations. A lineage of listening without questioning. Each repetition, a form of preservation, not of truth, but of fear disguised as virtue. When historians debate whether Margaret Ellis was savior or oppressor, they circle the same paradox. To believe she was righteous requires belief that silence can redeem. 2. Condemner demands acknowledgement that she once meant to protect. Both truths cancel each other, leaving only ambiguity, and that may be the most haunting legacy of all. The soil where her classroom stood was tested in 2019. Trace amounts of calcium, Phosphate bone residue were found just beneath the topsoil. It could be from livestock, as the county report insists. Or it could be from something older, something intentionally buried. The official records mark the site as non-significant. But for those who've walked the field at dusk, the stillness carries weight, as though the air itself remembers. Each anniversary, a handful of locals leave small tokens near the barbed wire. Chalk fragments, folded paper, a length of ribbon tied to the fence. No one claims them, no one removes them. It has become its own quiet ritual. Silence, performed again. The arithmetic remains unsolved. 13 desks, 12 names, 1 teacher, and an equation that resists closure. Every attempt to explain it only multiplies the mystery. Margaret's words linger, both warning and confession. The door is shut, but the lesson continues. Whether she meant salvation or surrender, no one will ever know. But one truth survives. Her, undeniable and immutable. Red Hollow may have vanished from maps. But obedience never leaves the mind. It only waits for someone to open the classroom again.